The Arkansas Bloodbath, the sheriff who slaughtered 12 men over a stolen badge. The summer heat in Crawford County, Arkansas, hung thick and oppressive, clinging to everything like a wet blanket. Sheriff Thomas Garrett wiped the sweat from his brow as he stood on the wooden porch of his office in Van Buren, watching the main street slowly come to life in the early morning of June 1887. At 42 years old, Thomas had served as sheriff for nearly 8 years, a position he'd earned through a combination of fair judgment and unflinching courage. His reputation stretched across 3 counties, a lawman who never drew his weapon unless absolutely necessary, but when he did, he never missed. The badge pinned to his vest caught the morning sunlight, a 5-pointed star that represented everything he'd worked for. His wife Margaret often told him he cared more about that piece of tin than he did about eating or sleeping. She wasn't entirely wrong. Thomas had inherited the badge from his father, who'd been sheriff before him, and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Garretts had worn that same star, each adding their own scratches and dents to its surface, each mark a story of justice served. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with Thomas's day. Deputy Clay Morrison burst through the office door, his face flushed and breathing hard. "Sheriff, we got a problem down at the saloon. Real bad one." Thomas turned slowly, reading the urgency in his deputy's eyes. Clay was usually unshakable, a veteran of too many bar fights and cattle disputes to get rattled easily. Whatever had happened must have been serious. "What kind of problem?" Thomas asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun belt. "The Dalton brothers rode into town about an hour ago, started drinking early. Randall Dalton's claiming you killed his cousin up in Fort Smith last year. He's looking for revenge, Sheriff. Says he's going to take that badge off your corpse." Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He remembered the Fort Smith incident, a bank robbery that had turned deadly when one of the Dalton gang had drawn on him. Thomas had fired in self-defense, but the Daltons had never been ones to care about the details of right and wrong. They operated by their own code, and blood feuds were currency in their world. "How many of them?" Thomas asked, checking his revolver with practiced efficiency. "4 that I counted. Randall, his brothers Pike and Vernon, and that half-breed tracker they run with, the one they call Snake Eyes." The name sent a chill through Thomas. Snake Eyes was a killer for hire, a man with no conscience and a reputation for torturing his victims. If the Daltons had brought him along, they weren't planning a quick gunfight. They wanted Thomas to suffer. "Get the mayor," Thomas said quietly. "Tell him to clear the street. Women and children inside. Everyone else armed and ready in case this spills over." Clay hesitated. "Sheriff, maybe we should ride out to the county seat, get reinforcements. 4 against 1 ain't good odds, even for you." Thomas shook his head. "By the time we got back, they'd have burned half the town looking for me. No, this ends now, one way or another." He walked down the dusty street toward the Dusty Rose Saloon, his boots making hollow sounds on the wooden planks. The town seemed to hold its breath, doors closing and shutters latching as word spread. Thomas could feel eyes watching him from every window, every crack in every wall. They were waiting to see if their sheriff would survive the morning. The saloon doors stood open, and Thomas could hear laughter inside, the kind of rough, mean laughter that preceded violence. He paused just outside, saying a silent prayer for Margaret and their 2 daughters, hoping this wouldn't be the last sunrise he saw. "Randall Dalton!" Thomas called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm here. Let's talk this through like civilized men." The laughter stopped. Heavy footsteps crossed the saloon floor, and Randall Dalton emerged into the sunlight. He was a bull of a man, 6'4" with shoulders like an ox, and a face weathered by a lifetime of cruelty. His hand rested on the gun at his hip, fingers twitching with anticipation. "Ain't nothing to talk about, Garrett," Randall said, spitting tobacco juice into the street. "You killed my cousin Bobby. Now I'm going to kill you. Take that badge, and wear it while I ride through this county doing whatever the hell I please. Gonna be a new law in Crawford County, and it's gonna be Dalton law." Thomas kept his voice steady. "Bobby drew on me first. I gave him every chance to surrender. You know that's the truth." "Truth is what I say it is," Randall growled. "And the truth is you murdered a Dalton. That means you pay with blood." The other 3 emerged from the saloon, spreading out in a semicircle. Pike and Vernon looked like younger versions of Randall. Same brutal build, same dead eyes. Snake Eyes was different, lean and coiled like a rattler, with ink-black hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He smiled at Thomas, revealing teeth filed to points. 4 on 1, Thomas observed. That's the Dalton way, isn't it? Never was one of you brave enough to face a man alone. Randall's face purpled with rage. You think you're going to talk your way out of this? That badge don't make you invincible. No, Thomas agreed, but it makes me responsible for every person in this town. You want me? Fine, but you let everyone else be. No collateral damage, no burning, no revenge on innocent folks after I'm gone. You give me your word on that and I'll face you right here, right now. Randall considered this, glancing at his brothers. Vernon nodded slowly. We ain't got no quarrel with the town, just you. You got my word, Sheriff, this ends with you. Thomas knew a Dalton's word was worth about as much as a Confederate dollar, but it bought him time. He squared his shoulders and prepared for what would likely be the last fight of his life. All right then, Thomas said. How do you want to do this? Randall grinned, showing yellow teeth. Old-fashioned way. We count to 3, we draw. May the fastest man win. Thomas positioned himself carefully, weight balanced, his right hand loose and ready. The sun had climbed higher now, beating down mercilessly. Sweat ran into his eyes, but he didn't dare blink. Everything came down to this moment. Years of practice, countless hours at the range, every lesson his father had taught him about staying calm under pressure. 1, Randall began. Thomas watched the man's eyes, not his hand. The eyes always told you when someone was about to draw. 2. Their dog barked somewhere in the distance. A shutter creaked. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Randall's hand moved before he said 3, just as Thomas knew he would. A cheat to the end. But Thomas had been expecting it, waiting for it. His own hand swept down and up in one fluid motion, the revolver clearing leather as Randall's gun was still rising. The shot rang out like thunder, echoing off the buildings. Randall staggered backward, a red stain spreading across his chest. His gun fired into the dirt as he fell, his eyes wide with surprise. He'd never believed anyone could be faster than him. Pike and Vernon drew simultaneously, but Thomas was already moving, diving behind a water trough as their bullets splintered the wood where he'd been standing. He came up firing, his first shot catching Pike in the shoulder, spinning him around. His second shot took Vernon in the leg, dropping him to his knees. Snake Eyes hadn't moved, watching the whole thing with those dead, calculating eyes. Now he stepped forward, drawing a long knife instead of a gun. I like to make it personal, he hissed, his voice like gravel. Guns are too quick, too easy. Thomas kept his revolver trained on the man. I'll shoot you where you stand. Not if you want to know where your wife and daughters are, Snake Eyes said softly. We paid them a visit this morning before we came here. Nice little farm you got. Be a shame if something happened to them. Thomas felt ice water pour through his veins. His hand trembled with rage, but his voice stayed level. You're lying. Snake Eyes pulled something from his pocket, a ribbon, pale blue with white flowers. Thomas recognized it instantly. It was Sarah's, his youngest daughter's favorite hair ribbon. Margaret had made it for her 6th birthday. Bring me that badge, Snake Eyes said. And they live. Try to fight me, and my partners waiting at your farm will gut them like fish. Your choice, Sheriff. Thomas's mind raced. This had been the plan all along, not just to kill him, but to destroy everything he loved. The Daltons had never intended to honor any agreement. He slowly lowered his gun, setting it on the ground. That's smart, Snake Eyes said, grinning. Now the badge. Nice and slow. Thomas unpinned the badge from his vest, feeling its familiar weight in his palm one last time. 3 generations of Garretts. 3 generations of service and honor. And now it would end in the dirt of a Van Buren street, handed over to a killer. But Thomas Garrett hadn't survived 8 years as sheriff by being stupid. As he extended his hand with the badge, he flicked his wrist, sending the star spinning through the air toward Snake Eyes' face. The killer instinctively flinched, raising his knife to block it, exactly what Thomas had counted on. In that split second of distraction, Thomas lunged forward, catching Snake Eyes' knife hand and twisting hard. Bone cracked and the blade fell. Thomas's other hand found the derringer in his boot, the small pistol he always carried as a backup. He pressed it against Snake Eyes' ribs and pulled the trigger twice. Snake Eyes collapsed, coughing blood. "Partners," he gasped. "At your farm." "You're a liar," Thomas said coldly. "You came here alone because you're too arrogant to think you needed help. My deputy's been watching my family all morning, just like he does every morning when trouble comes to town. You never had them." Snake Eyes tried to speak again, but death took him first. Thomas retrieved his badge from the dirt, wiping it clean before pinning it back to his vest. Pike and Vernon were both alive but wounded badly enough they wouldn't be causing trouble. Randall was already gone, his eyes staring sightlessly at the Arkansas sky. Clay emerged from behind the general store, his rifle still raised. "You all right, Sheriff?" Thomas nodded, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. "Get the doctor for these two, then lock them up. Wire Fort Smith for a marshal to come collect them, and Clay?" "Yes, sir. Make sure someone cleans this street before the children come out. They don't need to see this." Thomas walked back to his office, his legs shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Inside, he collapsed into his chair and pulled out the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. His hands were still trembling as he poured a glass. The door opened, and Margaret rushed in, her face pale with worry. She crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled him into an embrace that threatened to crush his ribs. "Clay sent word," she said into his shoulder. "I thought I'd lost you." "Not today," Thomas said, holding her tight. "Not today." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. He'd killed 3 men that morning, and nearly lost everything that mattered to him. The badge suddenly felt heavier than ever, weighted down with responsibility and the constant threat of violence. As the day wore on, and the town slowly returned to normal, Thomas stood on his porch again, watching the sun begin its descent. He thought about his father, his grandfather, all the men who'd worn this badge before him. They'd all faced moments like this, times when the line between law and chaos was razor thin, when one wrong move could cost everything. The badge caught the evening light, gleaming despite the day's violence. Thomas ran his thumb over its surface, feeling the old scratches and dents, wondering what new marks this day would add to its history. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The Dalton family was large, and blood feuds in Arkansas had a way of lasting generations. Somewhere to the north, in the hill country where the Daltons made their home, word was already spreading. Randall was dead, Pike and Vernon were captured, and the sheriff who'd done it was still wearing that badge, still walking free. The oldest Dalton brother, a man named Jeremiah who made Randall look civilized by comparison, received the news while skinning a deer. He wiped the blood from his hands and reached for his gun belt. "How many men we got?" he asked his lieutenants. 11, counting you," came the reply. Jeremiah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Get them ready. We ride for Van Buren at first light. That sheriff thinks he won today, but he just started a war he can't possibly win. By the time we're done, there won't be nothing left of Crawford County but ashes and memories." The sun set over Van Buren, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Thomas went home to his family, grateful for another day alive. He read stories to his daughters, kissed Margaret goodnight, and tried to forget the look in Snake Eyes' face as life left him. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house made him reach for the gun on his nightstand. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching horses. He'd won the battle, but somewhere deep in his gut, he knew the war was just beginning. The following morning arrived with deceptive peace. Thomas made his rounds early, checking in with the shopkeepers and saloon owners, making sure everyone knew the Daltons were either dead or locked up tight. The town seemed relieved, already starting to forget the violence of the previous day. That was how people survived out here, by forgetting quickly and moving on. Clay met him at the office around 8, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the morning mail. "Marshal from Fort Smith sent word," Clay said. "He'll be here day after tomorrow to collect the prisoners. Wants to make sure we got everything locked down tight in case any Dalton sympathizers try something." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully. "Good. The sooner they're out of my jail, the better. How are they doing? Doctor patched them up pretty good. Pike's shoulder's going to be stiff for life and Vernon might walk with a limp, but they'll both live to stand trial. Clay paused. They've been talking, though, making threats, saying their brother Jeremiah's going to ride down here with an army. Let them talk, Thomas said, though the name Jeremiah made his stomach tighten. He'd heard stories about the eldest Dalton brother, a man who'd allegedly killed his first person at age 12 and never stopped. Words are all they got right now. But Thomas was wrong about that, and by noon he'd know just how wrong. The rider came galloping into town at full speed, nearly trampling a vendor's cart in his haste to reach the sheriff's office. He was a ranch hand from the Morrison spread, about 15 miles north of town, and his face was sheet white with terror. "Sheriff!" he gasped, tumbling off his horse. "Sheriff, you gotta come quick. It's the Daltons. They hit the Morrison ranch about an hour ago." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The Morrison ranch belonged to Clay's uncle, a sprawling cattle operation that employed about 20 hands and housed 3 families. "How many Daltons?" "I counted 10, maybe 12. They rode in shooting, didn't give no warning. They killed Mr. Morrison and his wife, burned the main house. They're asking for you, Sheriff. Said to tell you they're going to hit every ranch and farm between here and the hill country, unless you come face them. Said they want that badge, and they want the man who killed their brothers." Thomas looked at Clay, whose face had gone gray. "Uncle Jack," Clay whispered. "Aunt Bethany, oh God." "Get Doc Miller and the undertaker," Thomas ordered another deputy. "Clay, I need you to—" "I'm coming with you," Clay interrupted, his voice shaking with rage. "They killed my family, Sheriff. I'm coming." Thomas wanted to argue, but he knew that look. He'd worn it himself yesterday when he thought his own family was in danger. "All right, but you follow my orders no matter what. I can't have you going off half-cocked, understand?" Clay nodded tightly. Understood. Within 20 minutes, Thomas had assembled a posse of 12 men, every able-bodied man in town who could shoot straight and ride hard. They were merchants and farmers, not professional gunfighters, but they were willing. More importantly, they understood what was at stake. If the Daltons weren't stopped now, every family in Crawford County was at risk. They rode hard toward the Morrison ranch, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly. Thomas tried to form a plan, but the truth was he was outgunned and outmanned. The Daltons had at least 10 experienced killers, men who'd been robbing and murdering their way across 3 states for years. His posse was brave but inexperienced, and going up against the Daltons in an open fight was suicide. The Morrison ranch came into view around 3 in the afternoon, and the sight made several of the posse members turn away in horror. The main house was nothing but smoking ruins, bodies lay scattered across the yard, and the barn was still burning, sending thick black smoke into the clear sky. But worse than any of that was the sight of 11 men on horseback, arranged in a line across the ranch entrance, waiting. They'd known Thomas would come. They'd been counting on it. The man in the center was unmistakably Jeremiah Dalton. He was bigger than Randall had been, broader in the shoulders and meaner in the face. He wore a Confederate officer's coat despite the heat, and a saber hung at his side alongside 2 revolvers. His beard was shot through with gray, and his eyes held the flat, dead look of a man who'd seen and done too many terrible things to be considered human anymore. "Sheriff Thomas Garrett," Jeremiah's voice boomed across the distance. "Nice of you to join us. We've been waiting." Thomas raised his hand, stopping the posse about 50 yards out. He rode forward alone, despite Clay's protests. "Jeremiah Dalton," Thomas said, keeping his voice steady. "This ends now. You surrender peacefully. Face justice for what you've done here, and nobody else has to die." Jeremiah threw back his head and laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Justice? You killed 3 of my brothers, Sheriff. You think there's any justice that don't end with you dead and your badge in the dirt? Randall drew on me first. Your other brothers are sitting in my jail, alive and getting medical care. I could have killed them too, but I didn't. This vendetta is over nothing but Dalton pride, and it's not worth all this death." "Pride is everything," Jeremiah roared. "My family's honor is everything. You think you can kill Daltons and walk away? You think that badge makes you untouchable?" "No," Thomas said quietly, "but it makes me responsible for protecting the people of this county, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe from men like you." Jeremiah's smile faded. Then you're a fool and a dead man. Boys, he gestured to his men. Kill them all, every last one. Leave the sheriff for me. I want to take that badge off his corpse personally. The Daltons spurred their horses forward, guns drawn. Thomas wheeled his mount around, racing back to his posse. Spread out, he shouted. Use the wagons for cover. Make every shot count. The next hour was hell on earth. The Daltons attacked like demons, riding in circles around the posse's position, firing from horseback with deadly accuracy. 3 of Thomas's men went down in the first 5 minutes, and 2 more were seriously wounded shortly after. But the posse fought back with desperate courage. They'd seen what the Daltons had done to the Morrison Ranch, understood that surrender meant death. They picked their shots carefully, using the overturned wagons and a stone well for cover. Thomas moved between positions, directing fire, pulling wounded men to safety, keeping everyone from panicking. Clay proved himself a natural fighter, dropping 2 Daltons from their horses with precise rifle shots. But it wasn't enough. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and slowly but surely, the Daltons were wearing them down. Jeremiah seemed invincible, riding through the chaos with bullets whizzing past his head, never even flinching. He was saving himself for Thomas, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Thomas ran out of ammunition for his revolver and had to reload behind the well. Jeremiah saw his chance and charged straight at him, saber drawn, roaring like a bear. Thomas barely got his gun loaded in time, firing twice as Jeremiah bore down on him. The first shot missed. The second caught Jeremiah in the shoulder, but didn't slow him down. The saber swung in a deadly arc, and Thomas threw himself backward, the blade missing his throat by inches. He hit the ground hard, losing his grip on his revolver. Jeremiah dismounted with surprising speed for such a large man, standing over Thomas with the saber raised high. "Any last words, Sheriff?" Jeremiah asked, blood streaming from his shoulder wound. Thomas looked up at the man, at the hate and madness in his eyes, and made his decision. "Yeah. Duck." Jeremiah's expression flickered with confusion for just a second, long enough for Clay to put a bullet through the back of his skull from 20 feet away. The eldest Dalton brother fell like a tree, dead before he hit the ground. With their leader gone, the remaining Daltons lost their nerve. 3 tried to run and were cut down by the posse. 2 more surrendered, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. The last one, a young kid who couldn't have been more than 17, just sat on his horse and cried, saying over and over that he'd only come because his brothers made him. When the smoke cleared and the shooting stopped, 7 Daltons lay dead, including Jeremiah. 2 were captured alive. 1 had escaped into the hills. Of Thomas's posse, 5 were dead and 4 more wounded. The cost had been catastrophic. Thomas sat on the ground beside the well, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Clay approached, his rifle still smoking, his face spattered with blood that wasn't his own. "You all right, Sheriff?" Clay asked. "No," Thomas said honestly. "I'm not all right. All of this death over a badge and family pride. How many people died today because of me?" "Not because of you," Clay said firmly, "because the Daltons were evil men who chose violence over law. You tried to stop them peacefully. They made their choice." Thomas knew Clay was right, but it didn't make him feel any better. He looked at his badge, at the blood splattered across its surface, and wondered if it was worth it. How many more would die before this was truly over? The young Dalton who'd escaped would tell tales of this day, and those tales would spread. More men seeking revenge, more violence, more death. But if he gave up the badge now, if he walked away, what message would that send? That outlaws could terrorize communities until lawmen surrendered? That might made right, and justice was only for those strong enough to take it. Thomas stood up slowly, his whole body aching. He wiped the blood from his badge and pinned it back to his vest. "Let's get these bodies collected," he said, "and get the wounded to town. This isn't over yet." He was right about that. It was far from over. Word of the massacre at Morrison Ranch spread like wildfire through Arkansas and beyond. In the hill country where the Dalton clan had their stronghold, families who'd been allied with them for generations heard the news and made a choice: either swallow their pride and let the deaths go unavenged, or ride against the sheriff who'd decimated their ranks. Most chose pride. It was the Dalton way. Over the next 2 weeks, a coalition of outlaw families began gathering in the hills north of Crawford County. The escaped Dalton, a man named Caleb, rode from camp to camp spreading his version of events, painting Thomas as a murderous sheriff who'd ambushed peaceful men, who'd killed children and burned homes, who wore his badge like a king's crown and terrorized anyone who challenged him. Most folks who heard the truth knew better, but the truth didn't matter much in the hill country. What mattered was family and blood and the old ways of settling scores. By the end of July, nearly 40 armed men had gathered under Caleb Dalton's leadership, all of them sworn to ride into Van Buren and kill Sheriff Thomas Garrett. Thomas knew they were coming. Reports reached him daily, travelers on the northern road who'd seen campfires in the hills, merchants who'd been stopped and questioned by armed bands, farmers who'd had supplies stolen by men wearing Dalton colors. The net was closing, and Thomas had to decide how to respond. He could call for help from Fort Smith, bring in federal marshals and maybe even army troops. But that would take weeks, and there was no guarantee they'd arrive before the Daltons struck. He could evacuate the town, send women and children to safety in Little Rock, but that would leave homes and businesses undefended, ripe for looting and burning. Or he could do what every Garrett before him had done, stand and fight regardless of the odds. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. Thomas Garrett was the sheriff of Crawford County, and he'd sworn an oath to protect its people. If that meant facing 40 men with whatever force he could muster, then so be it. He spent those 2 weeks preparing Van Buren for a siege. Every man in town who could shoot was given a rifle and assigned a position. Barricades were built at every street entrance. Supplies were stockpiled, wells were protected, and fire brigades were organized in case the Daltons tried to burn them out. Margaret wanted to take the girls and leave, but Thomas needed her to stay. She was one of the best shots in town, and her presence would keep other families from panicking and fleeing. They argued about it every night, Margaret crying and pleading, Thomas standing firm. Finally she agreed, on the condition that if things went truly bad, he'd get their daughters out no matter what. Thomas promised, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. August 1st dawned hot and clear, the kind of day that made you grateful for shade and water. Thomas stood on the roof of his office, scanning the northern horizon with a spyglass. He'd been doing this every morning for a week now, watching for the dust cloud that would signal the Daltons' approach. Today he finally saw it. A massive plume of dust rose from the hills, the kind kicked up by dozens of horses moving at speed. They were coming, and they'd be here by midday. "Sound the alarm now," Thomas told Clay, who stood beside him. "Get everyone to their positions. This is it." The church bell began ringing, its tone somehow different from the normal call to worship. This was the sound of war coming to Van Buren, and everyone who heard it felt their blood run cold. Thomas climbed down from the roof and made his final rounds, checking each defensive position, offering words of encouragement, making sure everyone understood the plan. When the Daltons came, they'd find the main street blocked and every window fortified. There would be no easy ride into town, no quick massacre. The Daltons would have to fight for every inch, and Thomas intended to make them pay dearly for it. By 11 o'clock, the town was as ready as it would ever be. An eerie quiet settled over Van Buren, broken only by the occasional shuffle of a nervous horse or the click of a rifle being checked one more time. Thomas positioned himself behind the main barricade on the north entrance, flanked by Clay and 6 other good men. Margaret was 3 buildings back with a clear line of fire, their daughters hidden in the church basement, with the other children and the elderly. Thomas tried not to think about what would happen if the Daltons broke through. There were nightmares down that road he couldn't afford to contemplate. They heard the riders before they saw them, 40 horses moving in formation, the sound like rolling thunder. Then they crested the rise north of town, and Thomas got his first look at the force arrayed against him. 40 men, just as the reports had said, all armed to the teeth with rifles and revolvers, some carrying torches despite the daylight. Caleb Dalton rode at their head, wearing Jeremiah's Confederate coat and carrying his saber. He'd fashioned himself as the new patriarch of the Dalton clan, and he intended to cement his leadership by destroying the man who'd killed his brothers. The riders stopped about 100 yards out, just beyond easy rifle range. Caleb urged his horse forward alone, stopping 50 yards from the barricade. "Sheriff Garrett," he called out, "you got one chance to save your town. Come out here. Give me that badge and accept justice for what you done to my family. Do that and we ride away peaceful. Don't do it and we burn Van Buren to the ground with everyone in it." Thomas stepped up onto the barricade where Caleb could see him clearly. "The only justice being served today will be from a judge and jury," he shouted back. "Your brothers were outlaws and killers. They got what they deserved, and so will anyone else who chooses to ride against the law." "You killed 12 of my blood," Caleb screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. 12? And you think you can hide behind that badge and avoid punishment?" Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest at those words. 12. Randall, Pike's wound had turned septic. He must have died in the jail. Vernon too, probably. Snake Eyes. Jeremiah and the 7 others at Morrison Ranch. That made 12 dead Daltons, all tied directly or indirectly to Thomas's gun. 12 men. It didn't matter that they'd been trying to kill him, or that he'd acted in defense of himself and others. 12 lives ended, and he was responsible for every one of them. But he couldn't let doubt show now. "Those men made their choices," Thomas called back. "They chose violence over law. Now you're making the same choice, Caleb. Walk away while you still can." Caleb's response was to raise his saber high and scream, "Daltons, kill them all!" The 40 riders charged as one, a wall of horseflesh and gunmetal bearing down on Van Buren like the wrath of God. Thomas dropped behind the barricade and raised his rifle. "Hold fire until they're at 30 yards, he ordered. "Make every shot count." The thunder of hooves grew deafening. Thomas could see individual faces now, young and old, hard and scared, but all committed to this course. At 30 yards he gave the order. "Fire!" 20 rifles spoke as one, and the front line of Dalton riders erupted into chaos. Horses screamed and went down, throwing riders. Men clutched at wounds and fell from their saddles. The charge faltered, but didn't stop. "Reload! Second volley!" The discipline Thomas had drilled into his defenders paid off. Even as the Daltons returned fire, the townspeople stayed behind cover, reloading with practiced efficiency. The second volley hit just as hard as the first, dropping more riders. But there were too many of them. The Daltons crashed into the barricade like a battering ram, some leaping their horses over it, others dismounting to fight hand to hand. The battle dissolved into chaos, rifle fire and pistol shots at point-blank range, men grappling in the street, knives flashing in the sunlight. Thomas found himself fighting Caleb Dalton directly, both men having lost their guns in the melee. Caleb swung his saber in wild arcs, trying to behead Thomas, but Thomas dodged and weaved, waiting for an opening. When it came, he lunged forward inside Caleb's guard, grabbed the younger man's wrist and twisted hard. The saber clattered to the ground. They went down together, rolling in the dirt, each trying to get a hand on the other's throat. Caleb was younger and stronger, but Thomas fought with the desperation of a man protecting everything he loved. His hand found a rock, and he brought it down hard on Caleb's temple. Once, twice, 3 times. Caleb went limp. Thomas staggered to his feet, gasping for air, and looked around at the carnage. Bodies lay everywhere, Daltons and townspeople both. The church was on fire, set alight by one of the torches. Women were screaming, children were crying. The street ran red with blood, and still the fighting continued. Thomas retrieved a fallen rifle and moved through the battle, rallying his people, directing fire where it was needed most. He was everywhere at once, pulling wounded civilians to safety, shooting Daltons who broke through the defenses, organizing bucket brigades to fight the fire threatening to consume the church. The battle raged for 3 hours, though it felt like days. Slowly, painfully, the defenders of Van Buren gained the upper hand. The Daltons had come expecting an easy fight against shopkeepers and farmers, but they found determined people fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. One by one, the attackers fell or fled, until finally the last Dalton threw down his weapons and surrendered. When the guns finally fell silent, Thomas collapsed against a bullet-riddled wall and surveyed the wreckage. 19 Daltons lay dead in the street. 8 more were captured alive. 13 had managed to escape into the hills. Of Van Buren's defenders, 11 were dead and 17 wounded. The church was half destroyed. 3 homes had burned. The main street looked like a battlefield, which it was. But Van Buren still stood. The people were still alive, and Thomas Garrett still wore his badge. Clay limped over, his left arm bound in a makeshift sling. "We did it, Sheriff. We actually did it." "At what cost?" Thomas asked, looking at the bodies being laid out in rows. He recognized every face. Merchants he'd bought supplies from, farmers he'd helped with property disputes, young men who'd grown up running past his office. All dead now because of a blood feud they'd had no part in starting. Margaret emerged from the smoke and chaos, her dress torn and blood-stained, her rifle still in her hands. She crossed to Thomas and embraced him without a word, and he held her while she shook with reaction. Their daughters were safe in the church basement, protected by stone walls and the bodies of men who died defending them. The aftermath took weeks to sort through. The captured Daltons were tried and hanged in Fort Smith, their executions witnessed by a crowd of hundreds. The wounded slowly recovered or didn't. 3 more townspeople died from their injuries in the days following the battle. The burned buildings were rebuilt. The dead were buried with full honors in the Van Buren Cemetery, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses. Thomas spent those weeks in a daze, going through the motions of his duties, but feeling hollowed out inside. Every night he dreamed of the faces of the men he'd killed. 12 Daltons, some of them looking surprised, some angry, some almost relieved that their violent lives were finally ending. He'd become the thing he'd always feared, not a keeper of peace, but a dealer of death. He'd killed 12 men in defense of himself and his town, but the number haunted him. 12 lives ended by his hand, directly or indirectly. That was more than any sheriff in Arkansas history had killed, more than some entire posses had killed in frontier wars. The newspapers dubbed him the Slayer Sheriff and the Hangman of Crawford County, titles that made him sick to his stomach. Margaret found him on the porch one evening in September, staring at his badge in the fading light. "You thinking about turning it in?" she asked quietly. Thomas considered lying, but Margaret had always seen through him. "Every day. I'm not sure I can do this anymore, Maggie. 12 men dead. I can't even close my eyes without seeing their faces." "They were trying to kill you," Margaret said firmly. "Trying to kill all of us. You did what you had to do to protect people. That's what wearing that badge means." "Maybe it means too much," Thomas said. "Maybe it's not worth this much blood." Margaret sat beside him and took the badge from his hands, studying it in the twilight. "Your father wore this badge for 20 years. Your grandfather for 30. How many men did they kill?" Thomas shrugged. "I don't know, a few, I suppose, but nothing like this." "They were lucky," Margaret said simply. "They never faced men like the Daltons, but if they had, they would have done exactly what you did, protected their people at any cost. That's what this badge represents, not violence, but the willingness to stand between evil men and innocent people, no matter the personal cost." She handed the badge back to him. "The question isn't whether you should turn it in. The question is whether you can still do the job. Can you still protect this county? Can you still uphold the law?" Thomas looked at the badge in his palm, at the scratches and dents, at the new tarnish from smoke and blood. He thought about the 11 men who died defending Van Buren, about the families grieving their losses, about the children who still needed someone to keep them safe from the next threat that would inevitably come. "Yeah," he said finally. "I can still do the job." "Then pin it back on," Margaret said, "and stop punishing yourself for surviving when others didn't. You're not the Slayer Sheriff or the Hangman. You're Thomas Garrett, Sheriff of Crawford County, and you're a good man doing a hard job. Don't let their newspapers or your own guilt take that away from you." Thomas pinned the badge back to his vest, feeling its familiar weight settle against his chest. Margaret was right. He'd done what needed doing, and he'd do it again if circumstances demanded it. The cost had been terrible, but the alternative would have been worse. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. As word spread of the Battle of Van Buren, as folks had taken to calling it, other towns began reaching out to Thomas for advice on defending against outlaw gangs. He wrote letters explaining his strategies, helped organize defensive networks between counties, and worked with federal marshals to track down the last remaining Daltons who'd escaped that bloody August day. By the time winter arrived, the Dalton clan had been scattered to the winds, their power broken forever. The hill country that had sheltered them for generations was finally open to law and order. New sheriffs were appointed, courts were established, and slowly but surely Arkansas territory became a little bit more civilized. Thomas never forgot the 12 men he'd killed, but he learned to live with it. He kept a private journal where he recorded every detail he could remember about each of them, not just how they died, but what he knew of how they'd lived. It was his way of honoring even enemies, of remembering that each of those 12 had been someone's son, maybe someone's brother or father. They'd made terrible choices, but they'd been human. On the 5-year anniversary of the Battle of Van Buren, the town held a memorial service for the fallen defenders. A monument was erected in the town square, listing all 11 names with the inscription, "They stood for law when chaos threatened, and gave their lives that others might live in peace." Thomas gave a speech that day, his voice carrying across the crowd of hundreds who'd gathered. 5 years ago, this town faced its darkest hour, he said. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and many believed we had no chance, but we stood together and we prevailed. The cost was terrible. These 11 men gave everything they had. But their sacrifice ensured that Van Buren remained a place of law and order, a place where families could raise their children in safety, a place where justice meant something more than the fastest gun or the biggest gang. He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his badge. I've been asked many times if it was worth it. All that death, all that violence, all that blood. My answer is always the same. I didn't start that fight. The Daltons did, when they chose revenge over justice, when they chose violence over peace. But we finished it, and in finishing it, we sent a message that echoed across 3 states. Arkansas is a place of law now. The days of blood feuds and outlaw gangs are over. There's a new era coming, and it's being built on the sacrifice of men like these. The crowd erupted in applause, and Thomas stepped down from the podium, suddenly exhausted. Margaret squeezed his hand as he rejoined her, and their daughters, older now, almost young women, looked up at him with unmistakable pride. That night, Thomas sat on his porch one last time with his badge in his hand. Tomorrow he'd pin it on again, and the day after that, and every day thereafter until age or fate took it from him. But tonight, he allowed himself to simply hold it, to feel its weight, to remember everything it had cost him and everything it represented. 12 men dead by his hand, or because of his actions. 11 defenders fallen protecting their home. Countless wounded, countless families torn apart. The numbers were staggering, the cost almost incomprehensible. But Van Buren stood. Crawford County was at peace. Children played in streets that had run red with blood 5 years ago, and they did so safely, protected by law and by the memory of men who'd refused to let chaos win. Thomas Garrett pinned the badge back to his vest and went inside to his family. The past couldn't be changed, and the dead couldn't be brought back. But the future was still unwritten, and as long as he wore this badge, he'd make sure it was a future worth the terrible price that had been paid. In the hills north of Van Buren, beneath a simple wooden cross, lay the last of the Daltons, 12 men whose choices had led them to violent ends. They'd sought revenge and found only death. They'd challenged the law and lost everything. Their story became a cautionary tale told across Arkansas and beyond, the story of how a blood feud spiraled out of control, how pride and violence only begot more violence, and how in the end, the law always prevailed, no matter how high the cost. And in Van Buren, in the sheriff's office where Thomas Garrett had served for 17 years total, that badge, scratched, dented, blood-stained, but still gleaming, hung in a place of honor, a reminder of a terrible summer when 12 men died, and a town learned what it truly meant to stand for justice. The Arkansas bloodbath was over. The sheriff who'd killed 12 men over a stolen badge had become a legend, but legends rarely capture the true cost of violence or the weight of responsibility that comes with wearing a star. Thomas Garrett knew that cost better than anyone, and he carried it with him every day until his retirement in 1895. He lived to see his daughters married, his grandchildren born, and Arkansas transform from wild territory to peaceful state. When he died in 1902 at the age of 57, worn out by years of hard service, the funeral procession stretched for miles, attended by lawmen from 6 states and civilians from every corner of Crawford County. They buried him with his badge pinned to his chest, as he'd requested. 3 generations of Garretts had worn that star, each adding their own marks to its history. But it was Thomas Garrett who'd tested it most severely, who'd proven that law and justice could prevail even against impossible odds, even when the cost was measured in blood. The badge itself was eventually donated to the Arkansas State Museum, where it remains on display to this day. Visitors can still see the scratches and dents, the tarnish from smoke and battle, the small dark stains that no amount of polishing could ever quite remove. It's a reminder of a different era, when law was sometimes written at gunpoint and peace was earned through sacrifice. But more than that, it's a reminder of a man who did his duty even when it cost him nearly everything, who stood for law even when easier paths beckoned, and who carried the weight of 12 dead men for the rest of his life because he understood that justice sometimes demanded a terrible price. The Arkansas Bloodbath claimed 12 lives directly, and 24 more including the defenders and innocent victims caught in the crossfire. 36 souls lost to one summer of violence, all because of pride, revenge, and a badge that represented something worth fighting for. Thomas Garrett never claimed to be a hero. He was just a man doing a job that needed doing, protecting people who needed protecting, and upholding law in a place where chaos threatened to reign. The fact that he succeeded despite the cost made him something more, not a hero perhaps, but a symbol of what law enforcement could be at its best. Dedicated, courageous, and willing to stand firm, even when the whole world seemed arrayed against it. The years following Thomas Garrett's retirement should have brought peace, but the ghosts of the Arkansas Bloodbath had a way of refusing to stay buried. By 1896, Thomas had settled into a quiet life on a small farm outside Van Buren with Margaret, spending his days tending cattle and watching his grandchildren grow. The badge he'd worn for 17 years hung in the museum, and a younger man named William Cooper had taken over as sheriff. Thomas thought his days of violence were behind him. He was wrong. It started with a letter in early March, delivered by a nervous postal rider who seemed eager to leave as quickly as possible. Thomas opened it at his kitchen table while Margaret prepared supper, and the words on the page made his blood run cold. Sheriff Garrett, you probably don't remember me, but I remember you. My name is Samuel Dalton. You killed my father Jeremiah and 11 of my uncles and cousins in the summer of 1887. I was 13 years old then, too young to ride with them, too young to fight. But I'm not young anymore. I'm 22 now, and I've spent every day of the last 9 years learning to shoot, learning to track, learning to kill. I'm coming for you, old man. Not for your badge, that's gone now, just for revenge, just for blood. I'll be in Van Buren by the end of the month. Get your affairs in order. Thomas's hands shook as he set the letter down. Margaret looked over his shoulder and read it, her face going pale. We need to tell Sheriff Cooper, she said immediately. Let him handle this. Cooper's a good man, but he's green, Thomas said quietly. He's never faced anyone like a Dalton. This is my fight, Maggie. It always was. You're 51 years old, Margaret said, her voice rising. You've got arthritis in your hands and your knees. You can't face a 22-year-old gunfighter and expect to win. Thomas looked at his hands, at the swollen knuckles and age spots that hadn't been there 9 years ago. She was right. He wasn't the man he'd been during the bloodbath. Time had taken its toll, and a young man in his prime would have every advantage in a straight gunfight. But Thomas Garrett hadn't survived 17 years as sheriff by fighting fair. He'd survived by being smart, by using strategy and preparation to overcome superior force. If Samuel Dalton wanted revenge, Thomas would give him a fight, just not the one the young man was expecting. I need to talk to Clay, Thomas said, standing up from the table. And I need to see that badge one more time. Margaret grabbed his arm. Thomas, please, we could leave. Go to Little Rock, or even further, start over somewhere he'll never find us. And spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders? Thomas shook his head. No, I stood my ground 9 years ago and I'll stand it now. This ends in Van Buren, one way or another. The next day, Thomas rode into town and found Clay Morrison at the general store he now owned. Clay had never fully recovered from the wound he'd taken during the bloodbath. His left arm hung stiff at his side, but his mind was sharp as ever, and his loyalty to Thomas hadn't diminished one bit. I heard about the letter, Clay said as soon as Thomas walked in. Word travels fast. What do you need from me? Information first, Thomas said. What do we know about Samuel Dalton? Clay pulled out a folder from behind his counter. I took the liberty of doing some asking around. Samuel's been making a name for himself in Indian Territory. He's fast, Thomas, real fast. They say he's killed 7 men in gunfights, never been wounded, never even come close to losing. He's everything his father and uncles were, but younger and smarter. He doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, doesn't make the stupid mistakes they made. Thomas studied the information Clay had gathered. Newspaper clippings, wanted posters, eyewitness accounts. Samuel Dalton had indeed become a formidable gunfighter, hired by various cattle barons and mine owners to solve their problems with extreme prejudice. He was methodical, patient, and absolutely deadly. He's also been training for this specific fight, Clay continued. One of my sources says Samuel's been practicing against men your age, studying how older fighters move, learning their limitations. He's not just coming for revenge. He's been preparing for it like it's a military campaign. Then we'll have to be smarter than him, Thomas said. I need you to help me set some things up, and I need to talk to Sheriff Cooper, make sure he understands this is personal and stays out of it. You sure about that? Clay asked. Cooper's got authority now. He could arrest Samuel the moment he rides into town. On what charge? Writing a threatening letter. That'll get him maybe a night in jail, and then he'll come for me anyway, probably when I'm not ready. No, better to control when and where this happens. Better to choose the ground. Clay nodded slowly. You've got a plan. The beginnings of one, Thomas admitted. But I'm going to need help pulling it off. Can I still count on you? Clay's answer was to reach under his counter and pull out an old rifle, the same one he'd carried during the bloodbath. I stood with you then. I'll stand with you now. Whatever you need, Sheriff. I'm not Sheriff anymore, Thomas reminded him. You'll always be the Sheriff to me, Clay said. Now tell me this plan of yours. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas prepared for Samuel Dalton's arrival with the same meticulous care he'd once used to prepare Van Buren's defenses. But this time, he wasn't preparing for a siege. He was preparing for a duel, and he intended to make sure every advantage was on his side. First, he visited the museum and borrowed his old badge, claiming he wanted to wear it one last time for a photograph. The curator, who remembered the bloodbath well, agreed without question. Thomas pinned the badge to his vest and felt the familiar weight settle against his chest. It felt right, like putting on an old coat. Next, he spent hours at the shooting range outside town. Not trying to improve his speed, he knew that battle was lost, but working on his accuracy. If he only got one shot at Samuel, it had to count. His hands might be slower, but they were still steady, and his eyes were still sharp at medium range. He also visited the town doctor and got a prescription for laudanum, claiming his arthritis was acting up. The doctor obliged, never suspecting that Thomas had no intention of taking the pain medicine himself. Meanwhile, Clay spread word through town that Thomas was expecting trouble and would be waiting at the old cemetery on the north edge of Van Buren on March 30th at noon. It was a public enough space that Samuel would trust it wasn't a trap, but isolated enough that innocent bystanders wouldn't be at risk. The perfect place for a showdown. Sheriff Cooper came to Thomas's farm 3 days before the appointed meeting, his young face creased with worry. Mr. Garrett, I can't let you do this. It's my job to keep the peace in this county, and that includes protecting you. I appreciate that, Sheriff, Thomas said, but this is bigger than your job or my safety. 9 years ago, I broke the Dalton clan's power in Arkansas. If I run now, if I hide behind your badge, all that work is undone. Word will spread that the great Thomas Garrett turned coward in his old age, and every outlaw from here to Texas will think they can come back. But if I face Samuel and end this, it sends a different message that justice in Arkansas doesn't have an expiration date, and the men who uphold it don't quit just because they get old. Cooper thought about this. And if you lose? If Samuel kills you? Then you arrest him for murder and hang him, Thomas said simply. Either way, the Daltons lose. Either I survive and prove they can't beat me, or I die and Samuel hangs for killing me. The blood feud ends regardless. Cooper didn't look happy, but he nodded. I'll be there watching from a distance. If he tries anything dishonorable, I'll step in. Fair enough, Thomas agreed. The night before the confrontation, Thomas sat on his porch with Margaret, watching the sun set over the Arkansas hills. They didn't speak for a long time, just held hands and listened to the evening sounds, crickets chirping, a distant owl hooting, the wind rustling through the trees. "I'm scared," Margaret finally said. "I know you have a plan, but I'm still scared. I can't lose you, Thomas. Not after everything we've survived together." "You won't lose me," Thomas said, though he couldn't entirely keep the doubt from his voice. "I've been in tough spots before." "Not like this," Margaret said. "Before, you were young and fast and sure of yourself. Now." She gestured at his weathered face, his grey hair, his hands that couldn't grip a gun the way they once had. "Now I'm old and slow," Thomas finished for her. "I know. But I'm also experienced and smart, and I've got something Samuel doesn't have." "What's that?" "I've got everything to live for," Thomas said. "Samuel spent 9 years consumed by revenge, turning himself into a weapon. But me? I've got you, our daughters, our grandchildren. I've got a life worth fighting for. That makes all the difference." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "You come back to me tomorrow, Thomas Garrett. You hear me? You come back." "I will," Thomas promised. "One way or another, this ends tomorrow, and I'll come back." March 30th dawned clear and cold, unseasonably chilly for late spring. Thomas dressed carefully that morning, putting on his best suit, the same one he'd worn to important trials during his years as sheriff. He pinned his badge to his vest, checked his revolver one final time, and kissed Margaret goodbye at the door. "I love you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I've loved you since I was 16 years old, and I'll love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Thomas said. "Tell the girls I'm proud of them, and tell the grandchildren their grandfather was a man who kept his word and finished what he started." He rode into Van Buren at 11:30, giving himself plenty of time to reach the cemetery and prepare. Clay met him at the edge of town, carrying a rifle and a grim expression. "He's already here," Clay said. "Got into town an hour ago. He's been asking around about you, confirming you'll be at the cemetery. He seems confident." "Good," Thomas said. "Confidence can make a man careless." They rode together to the old cemetery, a peaceful place on a small hill overlooking the town. Tombstones dotted the landscape, including the 11 markers for the defenders who died in the bloodbath. Thomas dismounted near those graves, letting his horse wander to graze. "You remember the plan?" Thomas asked Clay. "I remember," Clay said, "though I still think it's crazy." "Crazy's kept me alive this long," Thomas said. "No reason to change now." At exactly noon, Samuel Dalton appeared at the cemetery gate. He was everything the reports had described, tall and lean with his father Jeremiah's build, but his own cold intelligence burning in his eyes. He wore 2 guns, tied down low on his hips in the manner of professional gunfighters. His movements were economical and precise as he walked up the hill toward Thomas. "Thomas Garrett," Samuel said when he was 20 feet away, "I've been waiting 9 years for this moment." "Could have saved yourself the wait," Thomas said calmly. "Your father and uncles chose their path. I just responded to it." "You slaughtered my family," Samuel said, his voice tight with controlled rage. 12 men dead. You turned my mother into a widow, made me an orphan, destroyed everything the Daltons had built over 3 generations. And you think you can justify it by claiming self-defense? "I don't have to justify anything," Thomas said. "Your family terrorized this county for years before I ever put on a badge. They killed innocent people, burned homes, destroyed lives. I ended that. If that makes me a villain in your eyes, so be it. But history will remember the Daltons as outlaws and murderers, while I'll be remembered as the sheriff who brought law to Crawford County." Samuel's hand moved toward his gun. "History is written by the survivors, and you're not going to survive this day, old man." "Maybe not," Thomas agreed, "but neither are you. That's the thing about revenge, Samuel. It's a poison that kills everyone who touches it. You think killing me will give you peace? It won't. It'll just turn you into exactly what your father was, a killer with nothing to live for and everything to lose." "I don't want peace," Samuel said. "I want blood." "Then let's get to it," Thomas said. "Draw whenever you're ready. I won't ask for a count." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "You're awful calm for a man about to die." "I've been facing death for 30 years, Thomas said. It doesn't scare me anymore. What scares me is living without honor, dying without purpose, wasting my life on hatred the way you've wasted yours. So go ahead, Samuel. Draw your gun and become just another Dalton who died because he couldn't let go of the past." For a long moment, Samuel hesitated, and Thomas saw something flicker in the young man's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or a moment of recognition that he was about to cross a line he could never uncross. But then the moment passed, and Samuel's hand dropped toward his gun. He was fast, impossibly fast. The revolver cleared leather in a blur of motion that Thomas's aging eyes could barely track. But Thomas had been counting on that speed, had been planning for it. He didn't try to outdraw Samuel because he knew he couldn't. Instead, he did something Samuel would never expect. He dropped straight down, letting gravity do what his speed couldn't. Samuel's shot passed through the space where Thomas's chest had been a split second before, and in the moment of confusion that followed, Thomas fired from the ground. His bullet caught Samuel in the right shoulder, shattering bone and sending the young man's gun spinning away. Samuel screamed and grabbed at the wound, dropping to his knees. Thomas stood up slowly, his own gun still trained on Samuel. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're not dying, but you're not shooting anymore either. Surrender and I'll make sure you get medical attention." Samuel looked up at him with pure hatred burning in his eyes. "You think this is over? You think wounding me ends this?" "Yes," Thomas said, "because you're young enough to still make a choice. You can spend the rest of your life consumed by revenge, hunting me until one of us is finally dead. Or you can let it go, serve your time for assault with a deadly weapon, and build a life that isn't defined by what happened 9 years ago. Your father didn't have that choice. He'd gone too far down the dark path, but you're still young enough to turn back." "I'll never stop," Samuel gasped through the pain. "Never. I'll heal, and I'll come back, and next time you won't be so lucky." Thomas sighed. He'd hoped the young man would see reason, but the Dalton blood ran too deep. "I figured you'd say that." "Which is why I put laudanum in your canteen while you were walking up here." Samuel's eyes went wide. "What?" "Your canteen," Thomas said, nodding toward where Samuel had dropped it near the gate. "I had someone replace your water with water mixed with laudanum about an hour ago. You took a drink right before you got here. I saw you. It's a fast-acting dose, enough to make you sleep for about 12 hours. By the time you wake up, you'll be in Sheriff Cooper's jail, and the doctor will have patched up that shoulder." Samuel tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The laudanum was already taking effect, making his limbs heavy and his vision blur. "You cheated." "I won," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference. I'm too old to beat you in a straight draw, so I changed the rules. That's called survival, Samuel. It's the same thing your father should have done 9 years ago, instead of riding into Van Buren with 40 men. Samuel collapsed onto his side, his eyes fluttering closed. Within seconds he was unconscious. Sheriff Cooper emerged from behind a large tombstone where he'd been hiding, his own gun drawn. "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "Did it work?" Thomas asked. "He's breathing steady, and the shoulder wound isn't fatal," Cooper said. "Yeah, it worked. You actually beat him without killing him." Clay came out of his own hiding spot, limping slightly but grinning. "I can't believe you pulled that off. The look on his face when you told him about the laudanum." Thomas holstered his gun, suddenly feeling every one of his 51 years. His knees were killing him from dropping that fast, and his hands were shaking with delayed reaction. But he'd done it. He'd faced the last Dalton and survived without adding another body to his count. "Get him to the doctor," Thomas told Cooper. "And when he wakes up, tell him I'll visit him in jail. We need to have a long talk about the difference between justice and revenge." Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas visited Samuel Dalton in jail every other day. At first, the young man wouldn't even look at him, turning his face to the wall and refusing to speak. But gradually, as the pain from his wound faded and the reality of his situation set in, Samuel began to listen. Thomas told him stories about Jeremiah and Randall, about the choices they'd made and the consequences that followed. He talked about the 11 defenders who died protecting Van Buren, about the families torn apart by violence on both sides. He spoke honestly about the weight of killing 12 men, about the nightmares that still woke him up sometimes, about the cost that revenge extracted from everyone it touched. "Your father could have been something great," Thomas said during one visit. "He was smart, strong, a natural leader. But he chose to use those gifts for evil, and it destroyed him. You have the same potential, Samuel. But you're standing at a crossroads. One path leads to more violence, more death, more wasted years. The other path leads somewhere different, somewhere better. The choice is yours." "Why do you care?" Samuel asked bitterly. "I came here to kill you. Why not just let me hang and be done with it?" "Because you're young enough to change," Thomas said, "and because every death I can prevent, I will. I've seen enough killing to last 3 lifetimes. If I can save one more life, even yours, then maybe all that bloodshed meant something." Samuel was silent for a long time. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be anything but angry. I've been planning this revenge for so long, it's all I know." "Then learn something new," Thomas said. "You've got time. The judge is inclined to be lenient since you didn't actually kill anyone. You'll do 5 years, maybe less, with good behavior. Use that time to figure out who Samuel Dalton wants to be, instead of who Jeremiah Dalton's son has to be." The trial took place in May, and Thomas testified on Samuel's behalf, explaining the circumstances and arguing for mercy. The judge, who remembered the bloodbath well, sentenced Samuel to 7 years in the territorial prison with the possibility of parole after 5. As Samuel was led away in chains, he looked back at Thomas one final time. "I still don't forgive you," he said, "but maybe someday I'll understand." "That's all I can ask," Thomas said. Thomas returned his badge to the museum the next day, this time for good. His brief return to law enforcement had been exhausting, and he knew beyond any doubt that his gunfighting days were finally over. Sheriff Cooper assured him that Van Buren was in good hands, and Thomas believed him. Life returned to normal on the farm. Thomas tended his cattle, played with his grandchildren, and slowly felt the tension of those terrifying weeks drain away. Margaret stopped looking at him with worry every time he left the house, and the nightmares that had plagued him since the letter arrived gradually faded. 5 years later, in the spring of 1901, Thomas received another letter. This one was postmarked from Denver, Colorado, and written in a neat, careful hand. "Mr. Garrett, I served my full sentence and was released last month. I've been thinking a lot about what you said during those jail visits, about choice and change and who I want to be. I can't say I've forgiven you yet. Maybe I never will fully forgive you for killing my father and uncles, but I understand now why you did it. And I understand that they gave you no choice. I've decided to make different choices. I've got a job at a lumber mill here in Denver, and I'm staying away from guns and violence. I don't know if I'll ever be a good man, but I'm trying to be a better one than my father was. I thought you should know, that's all. Samuel Dalton." Thomas read the letter twice, then showed it to Margaret. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since this whole ordeal began. "You did it," she said. "You actually got through to him." "Maybe," Thomas said cautiously, "or maybe he's just telling me what I want to hear. But I choose to believe he means it. I have to believe that all this violence, all this death, can lead to something better eventually." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer next to the other letter, the threatening one from 5 years earlier. 2 letters from Samuel Dalton, one promising death, the other offering hope. They represented the full arc of the Dalton blood feud, from its violent origins to its peaceful resolution. Thomas never heard from Samuel again. He didn't know if the young man stuck to his new path or eventually fell back into old patterns. But he'd given Samuel a chance at redemption, and that was more than anyone had given the older Daltons. In his final years, Thomas often thought about those 12 men he'd killed during the Arkansas bloodbath. Their faces still visited him in dreams sometimes, but the nightmares were less frequent now. He'd made peace with what he'd had to do, understanding that sometimes the only way to stop violence was with violence. But that didn't make it any less tragic. When Thomas Garrett died in 1902, Samuel Dalton, now 30 years old and genuinely reformed, read about it in a Denver newspaper. He took a day off from his job, went to a quiet spot by the river, and said a prayer for the man who'd killed his father but saved his soul. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something close. an acknowledgement that Thomas Garrett had been a good man doing a difficult job in impossible circumstances. The story of the Arkansas bloodbath and its aftermath became legend in law enforcement circles, studied by lawmen throughout the West as an example of how to balance justice with mercy, when to fight and when to show restraint. Thomas Garrett's name became synonymous with a particular kind of courage, not the reckless bravery of a young gunfighter, but the careful, thoughtful courage of a mature lawman who understood that sometimes the hardest choice wasn't pulling the trigger, but finding a way not to. The badge itself remained in the Arkansas State Museum, a testament to an era when law enforcement meant something different than it would in later years. Visitors still stop to read the placard beside it, learning about the sheriff who killed 12 men in defense of his community, then prevented a 13th death by being smarter than his opponent rather than faster. And in Denver, Colorado, a lumber mill worker named Samuel Dalton occasionally stopped by that same quiet spot by the river, thinking about revenge and redemption, about the man who'd given him a second chance, and about the different path his life had taken because one old sheriff refused to add another number to his count. The Arkansas bloodbath had claimed 12 lives directly and 24 more in the surrounding violence. But it had also, in its strange way, saved one, proving that even in the darkest chapters of frontier justice, there could still be room for mercy, for growth, and for hope that the cycles of violence might finally be broken.